as a Google developer advocate for search-related topics and web. The web content ecosystem is what it's called. Our new team name, I think, is Search Relations. And I'm actually here to talk about something today that I think many developers are overlooking, and many people who are building things on the web in general are not necessarily seeing or using as much as they should. And that is structured data. What is structured data? Well, for those of you who have built websites in the past, they know that the web is inherently semantic. HTML, the hypertext markup language that we use to make our content, has lots of ways to describe what kind of content we are looking at, right? In this case, we have a website that has a header, it has a main heading, a title heading kind of, it has a navigation, which contains a menu probably that allows or affords us a way of navigating between different pages from the website or the web application. And then there is a section. In this section is an article, which is a coherent block of information that has its own subheading. And then there's an image. The image even has an alt attribute, which allows people who are non-seeing to understand what this image potentially portrays. And then we have some text markup, and that's it. Oftentimes, I see people kind of just using like div or paragraph or a span for everything. If you're doing that, don't. HTML has many, many ways of telling the browser and the user what content is in the sense of this is the header, this is the main part, this is a section that is contained in itself. There's an article that is a self-contained unit of information. Here is a header, there is a button, here is a link, there's an image. We have all this power. Use it and use it wisely. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't do diffs for images or something like that. Yes, sure, you can use CSS background images, but if you want to show an image, why don't you just use the image tag, for instance? But this is more about like how the information architecture looks like, what kind of information is semantically on the page, but not necessarily about the content, the semantics of the content. Because here, there's a header, there's a navigation bar, there's a headline, there's another headline, there's an image, but it's not really, is this an article? Is this a product? Is this a recipe? There's no information about what the content specifically is from a semantic point of view. And that's where structured data comes in. And with structured data, a community-driven open body of work that is called schema.org. The idea is basically, wouldn't it be nice to add additional semantics to describe the content of our page, not just in terms of the content structure that is relevant for rendering it in the browser and understanding from crawlers and stuff, but can we add more semantics? Can we give more rich information about what the website portrays, such as, is this a recipe? Is this a blog post? Is this an article? Is this a product? What is this? And what if we can do it in a way that is not just human consumable? Because humans probably, when I look at the website that we had before, this one, I can probably figure out, okay, so this is an awesome website, great. It has an article, that in the article there's an image of a cat. So it's probably an article about a cat. It's not a product, very unlikely to be a product. It's not a recipe, hopefully. Don't eat your cats. I mean, no shaming here, but... can we make this additional enriched information machine readable and not just express what this is about, but also how it relates to other things? Can we basically create a huge machine readable graph? Like this article appears in this website, which is the website of this company, which also sells these products. And basically, can we create a machine readable representation of the entire information that is there on the web? Wouldn't that be awesome? We would have a gigantic machine navigatable and machine readable database of the humanities information that is on the web. And how would we do that? Well, we kind of need a few standards, and we want the community to drive these things. So everyone, you can propose a new piece of structured data information, a piece of semantics that can be expressed. And also there are standards on how you would express them so that machines can read them as well. And mainly there's like 3 formats. And as far as I'm aware, all of them are W3 standards. I'm not sure about JSON-LD, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. One of the older ways of enriching your HTML so that it has this additional structured data and semantics was microdata. Microdata basically mixes the the human readable information with the semantics for the browser and the semantics for structured data. Basically HTML attributes. We'll look at that in a second. Then in the more academic world of things, people came up with the RDFA specification, which is I think it's XML based. It's a specification that specifies how to put some extra XML into your HTML that then also basically points at things and explores additional semantic information about what the content really represents. And then you can link things, and yeah, it's very interesting to read the specification. They have plenty of books about it as well if you're interested. But RDFA hasn't necessarily broadly caught on. And then there's JSON-LD, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. That's the JSON part, dash linked data. And I think the name perfectly represents what this is about. It's about linking different pieces of information together semantically and in a structured way so that machines can read it. So if you're familiar with JSON, you already know how to write JSON-LD. It's just a very specific kind of JSON that you have to write to make that happen. But let's look at how these formats look like. So this is microdata. Here we have a piece of HTML, a div with a span inside with an image and another div. And there's like a progress meter and then some additional text. Here we see, like, if you remove some of the semantics here, it's basically a div that says Panasonic white 60L refrigerator, then has an image of that product, and then has a meter that can go from 0 to 5 and is currently filled up to 3.5. So that's like a rating thing, how well it has been rated. And then it says also additionally rated 3.5 out of 5 stars, points, whatever. And then says also this is based on 11 customer reviews. That's normal HTML. There's nothing fancy. If it weren't for a few additional attributes that you might not have used so far, there's the item scope and item type, as well as item prop, HTML attributes. And what they do is they say, like, so here the item scope says like everything in here is one entity. And the item type says the entity that we are looking at is a product. And you can see there's this URL. https schema.org/product. So this is a semi-standardized, or I would say standardized, community-based notion of an entity. We know what a product is. It is described by certain properties. What are these properties? For instance, the product has a name. And that's where the item prop comes in. So now we have this block of information with an image in there, with some text in there, some more text and some numbers, and then this meter. But what do these mean in terms of the product description that we have in or regarding to schema.org? And then we can say, okay, so here's the thing. Here's a blob. The span has a blob of text. This text is the name of the product. So we are in a product block, and inside this product block, there's a name, and the name is Panasonic white 60L refrigerator. So now a machine does not need to know which text it needs to look at, because it can look at, oh, so the span is the name of the product, and then it can take just that piece of information. It doesn't have to be smart to understand that the based on 11 customer reviews is not part of the name, for instance, because we have specified this here. The image is just an image, and that's not really related to the product specification here. And then we have an aggregate rating. Aggregate rating is a different item. It's a different entity. So this is a product, and this product has an aggregate rating. That's why we see another item scope here. So everything in this div that says item scope and then says item type aggregate rating is its own thing. There is an aggregate rating of reviews or whatever kind of rating system, and it's part of the product. And the product can have, so the specification for product says this can have an aggregate rating. There we go. And then we have to tell it what the value is. In this case, we have the property rating value, and the value is 3.5. Fair enough. Then also, aggregate ratings have a review count. How many ratings is this based on? 3.5 out of 5. And how many votes were cast? In this case, 11. You see, this gets a little muddled. It looks kind of nice, and I like that you can do this like inline with your HTML, and yeah, but it's hard to spot mistakes quickly, especially if this content gets larger and stretches multiple screens. It also is kind of like muddled into the HTML, and then if some element somehow accidentally moves because you have a closing tag where one doesn't belong, then it breaks quite easily. It's not that easy to debug. It's not that easy to extract, actually. You would have to have a proper HTML parser. Not so easy. And we know that different browsers parse HTML differently, for instance, slightly differently. It gets better over time. I think now we are pretty much having like a solid common ground for HTML parsing, but like 20 years ago, that looked very different. So that was messy, but it worked. But then academia was like, no, I think we should do this like slightly differently. How about we add these like property things in here that says like, here is a title. This is much more granular as well. Like this entire thing has a title. The title is The Trouble with Bob. And it was created in a certain time. And that time is the, I don't know, depending on if this is an ISO date, it's probably the 10th of September in 2011. And that's more or less like microdata, but it has a different granularity. And also, it doesn't necessarily have to group things by entity. It basically just describes what the different bits and pieces are, semantically speaking. You can do that. It hasn't really caught on that much, as far as I can tell. There is a quite active academic community, and there's a lot of work being done, but we are not necessarily seeing it on many websites. And the last one is JSON-LD. That's JSON linked data. It's a normal JSON object, except that you put it in a script that isn't JavaScript. The script type is application LD, which is for linked data, plus JSON. And that signals to the browser and anyone who wants to look for structured data that that's what they're looking for. So they can look at the page, see if there is an application LD plus JSON tag. If there is one, then you can go for it and basically take the JSON in there and expect that to be structured data. In this case, this piece of JSON LD describes an organization. And hypothetically, you can have your own repository of semantic objects. But normally, you would refer to it on schema.org. So schema.org is kind of like the default global platform for defining semantics. And they have all sorts of semantics defined. And you say, like, so we are taking something from schema.org, and specifically, we take the organization property. So this website describes an organization. Its main URL is this, and then it has a logo at this URL. Great. This is a little easier to debug because it's JSON. It's a lot easier there's lots of tooling available for it. It's easier to generate this dynamically with JavaScript or with your backend programming language of choice. It's easy to debug because it's in one block, so you don't have to search things from different parts of the website. You just get this one block, and then you have the information that you need and can take that into validation tools, for instance. It's self-contained pretty much. Okay, that's great. Now we've seen 3 different ways of doing this, but why would I care? That's the question that many people ask themselves, and I asked myself as well, until I embarked on this journey a couple of years ago, where I wanted to see what I can do with things like Google Now and Google Assistant. And if you're writing HTML emails and you embed structured data, cool stuff happens. And the same is true for websites. One example that I like to point out here, because I happen to work in Google Search. So one thing that we do is what we call rich results. So if our crawler, which is Googlebot, sees your website and takes it in, it sees that there is structured data on it. And if there's structured data on it, that means that we can use a program to understand what is on this website potentially. And we don't have to just do smart things with the text that you give us and the images that you give us, because you give us additional information that we can just take in and then do something useful for the user and probably also for your website. So whenever we get the structured data and it's valid and we understand what it is, and it fits into the verticals that we support, which are many, like products, books, movies, courses, jobs. What else do we support? Recipes. If you have licensed image data that you would like to share, like stock photos or something that you create and want to share with people, you can do like all sorts of stuff. There's a website I'll show at the end where you can like find out more about this. And then once we have that, we can use the information and highlight your content in Google products, for instance. In this case, if I search for Google Home and find a website that happens to have this marked up as a product, then it understands, aha, so your website is about a product that is called Google Home, and the user is looking for Google Home, so they're probably looking for this product. So we can show the description of what the product is, the product name, how high it was rated, what price it currently sells for, if it's in stock or out of stock. This kind of information can be highlighted here, but not only here, it can also be highlighted in other surfaces like the Google Home device itself, or on Google Assistant, or in the Discover feed. So if you have a recipe, we can show how long it takes to make the recipe, which ingredients you need, how much calories it has, and all this kind of stuff can be highlighted to the user. And then, for instance, if it's a recipe that has structured data that explains the steps of preparing this dish, then that means that the Google Home can read out the steps, like first, slice the onions, at which point I would say I don't want to do this recipe, but that's up to you, obviously. But yeah, so we can use this machine-readable semantic information to highlight your content specifically. Doesn't necessarily mean that if you have structured data that we will always do that. There's other factors that go into this. But basically, fundamentally, when we have this information, you're eligible to be highlighted in these results. Other search engines do the similar thing. And definitely, we will probably see more like voice assistants and stuff that will need information from the web and will probably try to consume this via structured data because it gives you the semantics in an easier consumed way. Cool. Okay, so I definitely want these nice results. I mean, look at it. There's like stars on it. There's a price on it. So I can definitely get excited about it and want to click on the thing. So how do I actually implement this? Well, the first way to do that is if you're using CMS or some sort of platform, they might already do this. If they don't, there's very likely to be a plugin that allows you to do this. So basically, there's like WordPress plugins and Drupal plugins, and certain e-commerce platforms have that feature built in, that if I create a new product and give it a name and give it a price and give it an image and a description, that they also include the structured data in one of the three formats. And then Google and others can consume this additional structured data and then highlight your information. So you might already be doing this without even knowing. If you're not using a CMS or platform, and those, or maybe those you do, but those actually don't support it, then you have the opportunity to do it yourself. You can do that if you're using like PHP. You can totally do it in PHP, just like get the JSON LD block out there. That's fine. You can also do it in vanilla JavaScript if you're using like a headless CMS or something. Get the product information, or get not the product information, but get the information you need for the structured data you want to include, and then create the structured data on the go. Frameworks often have helpers or libraries for this. You can also do it in vanilla JavaScript. You don't need a framework for this. But what if you don't have a CMS and you don't want to actually touch the JavaScript on the page directly and do it vanilla yourself, because maybe you don't have access to the JavaScript that takes the data from the backend and then creates the front-end bits? Well, then you have a workaround that is Google Tag Manager. You can go into Google Tag Manager and run custom JavaScript that basically says, like, I don't know, for instance, the headline 2, the head H2 element on your page, that's the name of the recipe. In that case, you can pull that into Google Tag Manager and then put it into a JSON LD block and then put the JSON LD block on the page. So that's a possibility that you have to actually implement structured data as well if you don't really have access to the front-end code, but the front-end has all the information you need to actually have valid structured data on it. Yeah, and there's an example. Here we have a Vue component. Let's say the Vue.js component has a script tag with the appropriate type, which is application/LD plus JSON, and then does a Vue-HTML for the structured data property. The structured data property in this case is just a string. And when we are creating the component or when we're mounting the component, whenever we have the data available, then we can set the structured data to the block of JSON, in this case, again, an organization because it's short as an example. And then we load the base URL from the backend, for instance, and then we put in the logo path, and then we have the structured data for an organization dynamically generated in our Vue.js component. If you want to learn more about this, I only have so much time, unfortunately. If you want to learn more about this, I definitely recommend you go to goo.gle/search-gallery. There you find a list of, I can actually open this, I think. There you find a list of search-gallery. They find a list of verticals that we support and how it actually works in much more detail. So we support article, book, breadcrumb, carousel, course, critic review, dataset, employer aggregate reading, event, fact check, FAQ, how to, image license, job posting, job training, local business, logo, movie, estimated salary, podcast, product, Q&A, recipe, review snippets, site link search box, software app, speakable markup, subscription and paywall content, and video. If you have any of this, let's say like I run a podcast, you can click here and then you can see how it shows up. You see like this is what it would look like. I can actually make this larger, I think. Whoop. This is what it looked like in search results if it's properly implemented. And then you can figure out if you're hosting your podcast, or if you have an RSS feed, or if you are the recipe kind of blogger, then maybe you want them to show up nicely like this here with stars and how long it takes to prepare them, and with like a nice preview picture. And where else it might show up, like the carousel. So there's like different ways that we can choose to show such information. And here you see like a bunch of stuff. Here is an example of a recipe that is very, very detailed. And you can just click on this little button and you get sample code. You can play around with this. I can say like Martin's rainbow unicorn cookies, for instance. And then I can say test my code. You can also put a URL in here if you have a website that you want to test if the implementation is correct. And then you see like, yes, this is eligible. This is the HTML that we saw. This is how it might show up in the search results. So Martin's Rainbow Unicorn Cookies, it has been rated 5 out of 5 based on 18 reviews. It takes 50 minutes to make this. It might also show up like this. It might have like guidance where it's like yield is 10 cookies, 20 minutes preparation time, 30 minutes cooking time, has 270 calories. Here are the steps. So there's definitely a variety of ways this could show up, and this is kind of cool, I think. And you can see like what it shows up for. So there's a guided recipe in here. There's a recipe in here that does not have the guided bits and pieces. There are reviews in here. There's a video of the maybe the cooking process in here. So you can try this out and validate it in the testing tool, and then basically just like go wild with it. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very, very much. That was my talk. I hope that you got interested in trying this out. Definitely have a look at the URL that I share here and give it a go and let us know what you think, or if the documentation needs improvement, for instance.